The winter of 1887 came early to the valley where Harlan Creek bent south toward the timberline, and I was not yet done with what I had started. I know that now the way a person knows a thing they could not have said aloud at the time, the knowing arriving only after the years have settled enough that you can look back across them without flinching. What I did not understand, standing at the edge of my father's land in October of that year, with the sky coming in flat and gray from the northwest, and a smell on the air like iron and ice, was that the work I had been doing since early spring was the only thing that would decide whether I lived past February. I did not know the winter would be the worst the valley had recorded in living memory. I did not know how many neighbors would run short of wood and food before the thaw, or how many of them would come to stand at the edge of what I had made. Faces working through expressions they did not have names for. I knew only that the stump was hollow, that my father had shown me the principle one evening beside a fire that smelled of pine sap and rendered fat, and that the man at Olin's store had been calling my work a fool's nest since the blackberries were still on the vine. My name is Nora Keel. I'm telling you this story from a great distance of years, from a chair by a window that looks out over ground that once held nothing, and I want you to sit with it a while. If you are the kind of person who has ever been told that what you know is worth less than what you cannot produce a certificate for, this story belongs to you. I came to the 40 acres on Harlan Creek in the spring of 1887, after my father's death in March, arriving with a mule named Cobb, a brown dog I called Pell, who moved like a low shadow through tall grass, and a tin box my father had pressed into my hands the December before he died. The land was mine by the terms of his will, and that was the cause of much of what followed, because a woman receiving title to 40 acres without a husband was not something the men of Aldercroft had prepared themselves to accept with grace. My father had known this. He had made his provisions anyway. The land passed to me, and with it a small cabin that needed its chinking redone, a root cellar that had flooded twice, and a stand of timber on the northern edge of the property that had been lightning struck 30 years before, leaving a ring of dead and dying trees at its margin. At the center of that ring stood the largest stump I had ever seen, a white pine brought down in the strike, 5 feet across at the base and 4 feet high, the heartwood punky with rot in places, but the outer shell still dense and sound, the whole thing already beginning its long dissolution back into the ground. My father had been a builder in the way that people in such places were builders, which meant he had learned what held and what failed by working beside men who had learned the same from their own fathers, back and back through iterations of cold and need. He had never attended a school for it. He had read what he could find. What he knew lived in his hands and in the grain of his reasoning, and he had spent the last years of his life trying to move as much of it as possible into mine. It was in the fall of 1884 that he first showed me the principle I would spend the winter of 1887 depending on. We had been out walking the north edge of the property on a day in November, the ground already frozen under the leaves, and he had stopped beside a fallen hemlock that had been dead for years, its interior eaten away until it was a shell of bark and the outermost rings of wood, and he had said, "Press your hand against it." I pressed my hand. The wood was not warm in the way a living thing is warm, but it was warmer than the air, warmer than the frozen ground, and I said so. He said, "The tree taught itself to hold its heat before it ever died. That is the wood remembering what it was made to do." It was a plain observation, delivered in his plain way, and I did not fully understand its application until I stood in front of the stump on Harlan Creek in April of 1887, and asked myself what I had that could be made to hold heat through the worst a northern valley could produce. I had 40 acres. I had a cabin that would take a great deal of work to make tight. I had a stump that the land had already grown in its place for 30 years, its roots still going down into the mineral dark below the frost line, its shell already containing whatever warmth the sun could press into dead wood on a short day afternoon. I had my father's voice in my ear, steady as a hand on my shoulder, and I had all spring and summer to work. What I began in April drew the attention of Aldercroft's opinions by late May. The stump sat at the edge of my cleared land, visible from the road, and what I was doing to it was visible from the road as well. I had started by boring out the remaining punky heartwood with a long auger and a draw knife, clearing the rotten interior down to where the wood was still sound, shaping the inside into a chamber roughly the size of a root cellar, perhaps 6 feet in diameter and 4 feet high at its tallest point. The work of boring took 3 weeks, the auger biting in a half-inch at a time, Cobb waiting in the shade at the edge of the clearing, and Pell circling the stump in a slow orbit that diminished as the days passed, and she grew accustomed to the sound of iron against wood. I hauled the waste wood out in a barrow and burned it, because punky heartwood makes poor fuel, but makes clean ash, and the ash I needed later for the clay mixture I would press into the walls. I sealed the interior walls with a mixture of clay from the creek bank and pine pitch I had rendered from the stumps of the lightning-killed trees, applying it in 3 passes with a wide paddle, each pass allowed to dry before the next went on, so that by the time I was finished the interior was smooth and dark and held the smell of pitch and earth, the way a sealed jar holds a smell. I cut a low door into the south-facing side of the shell, framing it with timbers from the dead trees at the margin of the ring. Above the stump I began raising a low superstructure of peeled logs, nothing more than a narrow ridge roof to shed snow, its base resting on the outer rim of the stump shell and extending 2 feet out on each side to create an overhang. The ridge was no more than 8 feet at its peak. From the road it looked like a man had built a tiny house inside a tree stump and shingled it, which was, in essence, what I had done. Clem Ruck was the first to call it a fool's nest. He said it at Olin's store on the first Wednesday of June, in the hearing of 4 men whose names I knew, and the phrase passed into the valley's common speech before the summer was half done. Clem ran the largest operation in Aldercroft, 300 acres of hay and winter wheat, a barn that would take a person 4 minutes to walk end to end, and the settled confidence of a man who had never been wrong about weather, soil, or the proper construction of a building in his entire adult life. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had never needed to be uncertain, which produces in some people a cruelty of its own. He said it mildly, working a sliver of wood along his lower teeth, the way he said most things. That Keel's girl was building a fool's nest up on the creek, and he supposed she had the right to it. The other men laughed in the easy way of men who do not need to examine what they are laughing at. I heard the phrase second-hand that same evening, and I heard it again directly the following week, when I drove Cobb into town for a bag of nails and passed 3 men standing at the corner of Olin's lot. One of them, whose name I will not write here because he was young and later grew into someone kinder, called out across the road that Keel's girl was nesting again and asked if the stump was keeping me warm. I did not answer. I tied Cobb at the post and went into the store for my nails and came back out and drove home without looking in their direction, which I knew they would read as confirmation of something. It was not confirmation of anything except that I understood where my attention was better spent than on them. My neighbor to the east, a widow named Fern Aldous, who had been quietly kind to me since my arrival, heard the phrase and brought it to me herself, setting it down between us on my kitchen table, like a thing she wanted me to take the measure of. I took its measure. I told her what my father had shown me and what I believed the stump would do come winter. She sat with that a moment. Then she asked if I needed help with the clay, and I said yes. Fern became the story's only witness to what I was building and why, and she brought her grandson Harley, a quiet boy of 12 who had the gift of working without talking, and between the three of us we finished sealing the interior walls by August. I had cut a ventilation hole no larger than a man's fist at the apex of the stump shell, screened it with wire to keep birds out, and set a simple damper of shaped tin inside it so I could close it down to a crack in the worst cold. Below the floor of the chamber, I had laid a foot of dry sawdust and tamped clay in alternating layers, the principle being that the earth below the frost line holds a temperature not far below 50 degrees, regardless of what the air above it does. And that dead wood is among the best insulators a person can put their hands on, without manufacturing anything. The stump shell was 12 to 14 inches thick at its narrowest, with the clay sealed inside and the ridge roof sheeting the snow load away from the walls. I believed the structure would hold a temperature a person could live in without more than a small fire. There was no way to test it in August. You can understand a principle and still not know, when August is pressing in warm and full of bees, whether the thing you have made from that principle will hold when the temperature drops to 30 below and stays there for 3 weeks. There is a particular quality of uncertainty in that position, the kind that settles into the space behind your breastbone and does not shift. I had the stump. I had the principle. I had Pell curled at my feet in the evenings, and Cobb in the barn, and Fern's kitchen within walking distance, and the knowledge that if I was wrong, the cabin would still be there, drafty and thin-walled as it was. I should tell you what else the valley did not see, because the structure they were calling a fool's nest was only part of what I had been building. Inside the chamber I had fit a small iron stove, barely 2 feet tall, its flue running up through a sleeve of clay-packed stone through the stump shell and out above the ridge roof. That stove, at its lowest burn, was capable of holding the interior of the chamber at a temperature that would not freeze water. I had packed the floor with hay inside a frame of peeled poles. I had built low shelves along 1/4 of the curved wall, and on those shelves through July and August, I had stored dried beans, cornmeal, smoked meat, lard in a sealed crock, and 3 dozen jars of preserved vegetables that Fern and I had put up together in her kitchen. The stump held more than a person might think. It held the things a person needed to keep alive for the better part of a season, and it held them in a space that would not require burning through a winter's worth of wood in a fortnight to stay above freezing. The wood I put up was the part of my preparation that was most visible and most commented upon. I cut and split through July and August every morning before the heat climbed, working the dead timber at the north edge of the property and stacking it against the east wall of the stump under the overhang. By the 1st of September, I had a cord and a half under shelter. By the 1st of October, when I was still cutting, I had 2 cords and a half stacked in a row that Clem Ruck, riding past on his way to the lower road, pulled his horse up to look at. He said nothing that day. He looked at the wood and at the stump and at the low ridge roof above it, and then he rode on. Pell watched him go from the edge of the cleared ground, standing very still until the sound of the hooves had faded, and then she came back to my side. Clem Ruck named it again in October, standing at the edge of my property with 2 other men I knew by sight, looking at the ridge roof and the low door and the pile of split wood I had been adding to along the east wall, now stacked head high and running the full width of the overhang. He said she was building provisions for a fool's nest, and he supposed the winter would settle the matter. His tone was still mild. He genuinely believed the winter would settle it in his favor. If you are still here when the cold comes, leave a word below for Nora, and for the ones who had less reason to believe in her than she had to believe in herself. The cold came on the 22nd of November, 1887, falling out of the north overnight and reaching 12 below zero before the week was out. That was early, and the valley felt it early, but not yet with the true weight of what was coming. I moved into the Stump chamber on the 1st of December, bringing Pell with me, leaving Cobb in the barn with a double measure of hay and a lamp that I checked morning and evening. The cabin I left provisionally, its door latched, its hearth cold. I wanted to know what the Stump could do before I needed it to do everything. What it did on that first night was hold 51 degrees without a fire. I had measured it with a glass thermometer my father had left in the tin box, one of the few instruments he had owned, and I set it in the center of the space when I entered in the late afternoon, and read it by lantern light before I slept. 51 degrees. The air outside was 2 above zero. The stump wall between me and the air outside was 14 inches of clay-sealed dead white pine and my own packed work, and it was doing what my father had said it would do. I built a small fire in the iron stove anyway, because a person wants to be sure. And by 9 that evening, the chamber was 63 degrees, on a night when the outside temperature had dropped to -4. I did not write it down. I did not need to. I carried the numbers with me the way you carry a lit lamp through a dark room, carefully without hurrying. The smell of the chamber that first winter was the smell of clay and pitch and dry hay and wood smoke, close and warm and slightly mineral, like a root cellar that someone had also lived in for years. Pell settled herself against the curved wall on a fold of wool blanket and didn't move again until morning, and the sound of her breathing was a steady thing in the dark, patient as the stump itself. I lay on my side on the hay-packed floor, with the lantern turned low and the small stove ticking as its iron contracted in the cooling hours after midnight. And I thought about what my father had said about the hemlock and about the wood remembering, and I understood for the first time that what he had been teaching me was not a technique, but a way of seeing. That the materials the world sets in front of a person carry within them a record of what they are capable of, and that the work of a careful person is to read that record and take it seriously, which the world will reliably call foolish right up until the moment it cannot. By the 10th of December, the valley understood it was not an ordinary winter. The temperature dropped to -17 on the 12th and stayed below zero for 11 days running, the kind of stretch that separates adequate preparation from insufficient preparation with the blunt authority of arithmetic. I moved Cobb into the space behind the barn's interior partition and packed the gap with hay bales. I checked the stump morning and night, keeping the stove at its lowest. The ventilation damper cracked to a finger's width, the interior temperature reading between 55 and 62, depending on how long since I had fed the fire. Pell moved among the shelves and the hay-packed floor without concern, pausing occasionally at the door when I opened it to take in wood, stepping once or twice to the threshold to read the cold air with her nose, then returning to her place. She was not troubled. A dog knows what temperature means, and she was not troubled. On the 17th of December, Fern Aldous came to tell me that the Marsh family, 2 properties north, had burned through their seasoned wood in 9 days and were now burning green-cut timber that produced more smoke than heat and was eating itself twice as fast. Martin Marsh had frostbitten 2 fingers on his left hand, trying to keep the gap in his cabin wall chinked. Their youngest, a girl of 4, had been sleeping between her parents for warmth since the 2nd week. Fern herself had closed off all but 2 rooms of her house and was burning carefully. But she was not young, and the cold had gotten into her back and was staying there. I told Fern to bring the Marsh family down. I told her to bring herself. She looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before, which was the expression of a person trying to make a space inside themselves for a thing they had not expected to need to make room for. She said, "The stump." I said, "Yes." She said, "All of us." I said, "There is floor enough for 3 families, and I have provisions for 4 months." By the 20th of December, 7 people and 2 dogs were living in the Stump chamber on Harlan Creek. The Marsh family, which was Martin and his wife, Clara, and their 2 children, the girl of 4 and a boy of 9. Fern. A man named Dewey Pyle, who had come from 2 properties west after his own cabin's roof failed under snow load. A bachelor of 50 who had not spoken to me since May, except to tell Clem Ruck in my hearing that the stump was the most sensible kind of foolishness he had ever seen. He had meant it as a compliment. At the time, I had not been sure. 7 people and 2 dogs and a mule checking in every morning, all of us breathing the close, warm air of a space that the world outside would have judged too small for one person's comfort, and none of us freezing. The days inside the stump developed their own order, the way any confined life develops order, because order is how people maintain their dignity when space is short. Fern took the task of rationing the provisions, setting out each meal's portion from the shelves in the morning with a precision that left no room for argument and generated none. Martin Marsh kept the wood supply organized, replenishing from the stack outside in 2-hour shifts so that no single person bore the full weight of the cold exposure. Clara Marsh managed the children who were, in the manner of children enclosed with adults, simultaneously far more resilient and far more demanding than adults ever expect. The boy, whose name was Owen, had taken it upon himself to keep account of the days since they had moved in, scratching a mark each morning on a smooth section of the stump's inner wall with a nail. When I noticed it, I did not ask him to stop. It seemed to me a reasonable thing for a 9-year-old to need. The stove ran 4 hours a day on a quarter load of split wood. In the cabin, Martin Marsh had been burning 4 to 5 hours a day on a full load before his wood ran out, the heat escaping through every seam, the structure hemorrhaging warmth the way a cracked vessel loses water. The stump did not hemorrhage. The stump held. The clay-sealed shell and the dead wood beneath it and the foot of dry insulation below the floor did what my father had said they would do. They remembered what wood was made to do. Pell moved among the 7 of us with the quiet authority of a dog who knows it is needed, settling against whoever was coldest, redistributing herself through the night. The children named her again in the way children will name a thing they feel has saved them, calling her Old Pell, which she was not, being barely 3 years old, but they meant by it something about permanence and steadiness that I understood. Clara Marsh braided the girl's hair by lantern light and told stories about her own grandmother's winters in the hill country, and Martin checked the thermometer 3 times a day and reported the readings to whoever was listening with the gravity of a man performing an act of devotion. Dewey Pyle repaired a crack in the stove's doorplate with a wrap of wire and clay, which held for the remainder of the winter and for 6 winters after that. The cold reached its peak on the 4th of January, 1888, at minus 31 degrees by the thermometer my father had left me. The stump chamber held 58 degrees on a quarter-load fire. I have thought many times about that distance, the 89 degrees between the air outside and the air where Clara Marsh's daughter was sleeping, and I have never found a way to hold it in my mind all at once. Some numbers are too large to comprehend directly. You can only stand beside them and feel their shadow. Across the valley during those weeks, the winter settled its account with the careless and the unprepared in the way that all accounts eventually settle. Clem Ruck burned through his store of seasoned wood on the 7th of January and sent his hired man, a young Norwegian named Anders, to buy seasoned cordwood from the neighbors at twice the going rate. There was not much to be bought. 3 families in the lower valley lost livestock. a combined count of 11 head of cattle and 2 horses. The animals found stiff in barns that had not been banked or packed against the cold. One family, the Garveys on the South Road, packed their household into a wagon and drove 40 miles to stay with relations before the worst of it, leaving their property to whatever the winter chose to do with it. What the winter chose to do was collapse their well cover and freeze the pump solid, which cost them 2 weeks of work in the thaw. The valley lost, in total across those 11 weeks, more livestock, more food stores, and more stored heat than it would reckon fully until spring. In the Stump on Harlan Creek, the 7 of us came through with full provisions and frostbite on no one. I had burned less than 1/3 of my wood store. Pell had eaten half her winter's allowance of dried meat and was still putting weight on, which a dog in cold has no business doing unless the space she is living in is genuinely warm. The children had colored in a paper book that Fern had brought from her house, filling in the pictures with charcoal and berry stain, and those pages were still bright in the spring when I found the book on the shelf behind the bean jars. Clem Ruck came on the 14th of January on a day when the temperature had risen briefly to a merciful -8, and the sky was the pale blue of something that has spent itself and is resting. He came alone, which I had not expected. He stood at the edge of my cleared land for a long moment, looking at the stump with its thin plume of smoke rising from the flue cap above the ridge roof, and then he came across the frozen ground and stopped 2 feet from the low door and did not say anything for a while. I had heard him coming through the snow, and I had come out to stand at the threshold, the warmth of the chamber pressing out behind me, fog rolling from my breath and from the open door into the winter air. Pell sat at my left side. Clem Ruck looked at the door, at the warmth visible as a shimmer in the cold air beyond it, and then he looked at me. He was a man who had built 300 acres of operation from very little, and he was not unacquainted with the feeling of being wrong, but he had not been required to hold that feeling in public very often, and it was working on his face in a way that was difficult to watch and necessary to watch. He said, finally, "She holds." That was all. 2 words. He had not come to apologize, and I had not wanted him to. He had come to understand something, and 2 words was how much of the understanding he could move from the interior of himself to the cold air between us, and it was enough. I said yes. He nodded once, the kind of nod that closes a question, and then he said he had some families south of the road that were running low, and did I have room? I said I had room. He sent them that afternoon. By the end of January, there were 11 people in and around the stump, the chamber itself holding 7 at night with the children doubled up on the hay floor, and Dewey Pyle and Martin Marsh and Clem's hired man Anders rotating through the barn with Cobb on a system of shifts that kept no one outside for more than 2 hours at a stretch. The wood I had put up lasted, with careful burning, through the 22nd of February. The snow broke fully in the first week of March, when Aldercroft came back to itself in the thaw and counted what the winter had cost. It found the numbers harder to set down than it had expected. 7 households had sustained serious losses, 3 of them in livestock that would take 2 seasons to rebuild. 2 families had sustained structural damage to their homes. The valley had fed 11 people through the worst of it in a stump that its most confident voice had called a fool's nest, and the fool's nest had not failed. The phrase did not last another season. By the following fall, when the first frosts came, and the men at Allen's store began talking about the winter preparation, the way men in that country always talked about it, the stump on Harlan Creek had acquired a different name. They called it the Keel Shelter, which was not a grand name, but it was an honest one. Clem Ruck told Anders to study the construction before he began work on the insulation packing for the barn's north wall, and Anders, who was a careful young man, spent 2 afternoons on my property, asking questions and taking notes in a small oilskin-covered book he carried in his coat. He copied what he could see, but he was not yet sure what he was looking at, and I could tell he was not sure. So I sat down with him on the second afternoon and told him what my father had told me. I told him about the hemlock and the heat inside the dead wood, and about the principle of what holds against what loses, and about the clay seal and the sawdust and the layered insulation below the frost line, where the earth remembered its own temperature, regardless of what the air above it was doing. He wrote it down carefully. He understood it. The understanding was the thing that mattered. Copying the shape of a structure without the principle behind it produces a structure that looks right and fails when it is needed. And I had seen enough of that kind of failure to want to give him what he actually needed, which was not a measurement but a reason. Anders built 3 structures on his own later homestead in the years that followed, none of them stumps, all of them applying the same principle in forms appropriate to what was available to him. And he taught it to his brother-in-law and to 2 neighbors, and they in turn carried it further into the valley and into the hill country to the east, where the winters were worse and the timber was less reliable. And the principle, it turned out, was more necessary than anywhere it had yet been applied. The knowledge went where knowledge goes when it is given freely and received with the care it deserves, which is outward and forward, through hands and memory, into country it has never before entered. Fern Aldous lived 11 years past that winter, and in each of those years she came to the stump on a morning in early November to set a flat stone on the threshold, a practice she had begun in the spring of 1888 without explaining it, and which I never asked her to explain, understanding that it was a form of reckoning too personal to need a name. When she died in the spring of 1898, Harley, who was by then a young man of 23 with his own 40 acres and a wife expecting their first child, continued the practice on her behalf, setting 2 stones on the threshold in the first November after her death, one for Fern, and one, he said when I asked him for what she had believed before she had any evidence to believe it. Martin Marsh frostbitten no further fingers. Clara Marsh's daughter grew up and married a man from the timber country to the north, and told her own children in the evenings of the winters of the next century about the stump and the warmth inside it, and the dog who had slept against whoever was coldest. Those children told theirs. Pell lived to 13 years old, which is a good life for a dog, and she spent her last winter in the stump chamber as she had spent her first, curled against the curved wall with the small stove putting out its steady warmth and the snow pressing in close outside. She died in the spring of 1900, in the first week of the thaw, on a morning when the mud was beginning to show at the edges of the cleared ground, and the creek was running high and cold with the melt. I buried her at the base of the stump, in the ground between 2 outer roots, where the frost line runs deep, and the earth below it is a temperature that does not change. The stump is still standing. I have not been to Harlan Creek in many years, but Harley's son wrote to me in the winter of 1921 to say that the shell was still sound at the base, the ridge roof long since replaced and replaced again, the chamber used now mostly for cold storage of root vegetables, the principal long since removed from its original housing into a dozen other structures in the valley that no one calls by any name at all, because knowledge, when it has traveled far enough from its source, becomes simply what people know. It becomes the shape of a good wall, and the reason a cellar is packed a certain way, and the instruction a father gives a daughter on a cold November walk beside a fallen hemlock. A hand pressing against dead wood, the warmth still there. I think about what my father saw when he pressed his hand against that hemlock, what he understood, and what he chose to pass along. He was not a man who gave speeches or wrote things down. He was a man who pressed his hand against dead wood in the cold and said, "The tree taught itself to hold its heat before it ever died." He was a man who understood that the most useful thing he owned was not the 40 acres or the cabin or the mule, but the capacity to read what the world was offering, quietly and without ceremony, and to build from it. He gave me that. He gave me nothing else worth mentioning. And I have spent the whole of my life discovering that it was sufficient. The valley they call Harlan now is not the valley I arrived in. The same way a river seen after many years is the same river, and not the same river. The bed altered by floods and low seasons, the banks cut differently, the trees overhead grown taller and replaced and grown tall again. The people there now are the children and grandchildren of the people I knew, and most of them do not know my name, which seems to me entirely correct. What they know is how to pack a wall, and where to site a root cellar, and why dead wood, sealed right, holds against cold in a way that no one who hasn't experienced it will believe until they have pressed their hand against it and felt the warmth still living there. They do know they learned it from me, and I did not learn it from nothing, and the knowledge is older than any of us and will outlast all of us, passing from hand to hand the way warmth passes, not diminishing in the transfer. Pell is buried between two roots at the base of the stump, underground that does not freeze deep enough to disturb her. I put a flat stone above her in the spring of 1900, and Harley's son told me in his letter that the stone was still there, tucked in close against the root, moss-covered now, legible to no one who did not already know what it marked. The winter comes every year. It does not ask permission, and it does not show mercy, and it does not care what any man or woman has said at any store on any Wednesday about what will hold and what will fail. It comes, and it measures what was built and what was not built, and then it passes, and what is left is the answer.